Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to the slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify the time that I use on it, thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. So if you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you'd like to keep it going out to thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting it on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can also get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. So go along there, take a look, and sign up if you're interested. If monthly is a big ask, you can also make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. And if you'd like to support the show without having to do so financially, just tell people about it. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep, tell them where to find Sleepy Time Tales and see how it works for them. And that's enough of that for tonight. We actually have quite an action-packed episode as we talk about the second attack of the Persians on Greece and the Battle of Thermopylae, which pretty much everyone has heard about. But believe me, the way I'm reading it, this isn't going to be nearly as exciting as 300. Return this week to the Book of the Ancient Greeks by Dorothy. The Great Persian Invasion under Xerxes. The preparations. The Persians. The Persians came again. When the report came to Darius of the battle which was fought at Marathon, the king, who even before this had been greatly exasperated with the Athenians on account of the attack made upon Sardis, then far more before displayed indignation, and was still more determined to make a campaign against Hellas. He at once sent messengers to the various cities of the empire and ordered that they should get ready their forces. Each city or community was called upon to send more men than at the former time, and to send also ships of war and horses, provisions and transport vessels. When these commands had been carried all around, all Asia was moved for 3 years, for all the best men were being enlisted for the expedition against Hellas, and were making preparations. But before the expedition was ready, a rebellion broke out in Egypt, and soon after Darius died, and thus he did not succeed in taking vengeance upon the Athenians. Darius was succeeded by his son Xerxes. The first thing he did was to crush Egypt, and then he turned his attention to Greece. Mardonius, the general who had been forced to retire from Thrace after the wreck of the fleet off Mount Athos, was anxious to persuade the king to undertake another invasion. He probably wanted to retrieve the reputation he had lost on the former occasion, and hoped that if Greece became a Persian province, he would be made governor. "Master," he would say to the king, "it is not fitting that the Athenians, having done to the Persians very great evil, should not pay the penalty for which they have done. And he would add that Greece was a very fair land, and bore all kinds of trees that are cultivated for fruit, and that the king alone of all mortals was worthy to possess it. Xerxes did not need much persuasion. He came of a race of kings whose word was the law of the Medes and Persians that changeth not. And his wrath was great that the states that had not only refused to submit to the Persian king, but had actually defeated his army in battle. He would wreak his vengeance upon them for what they had done, and he declared that he would march an army through Europe against Greece, in order, as he said, that I may take vengeance on the Athenians for all things which they have done, both to the Persians and to my father. I will not cease until I have conquered Athens and burnt it with fire. Our knowledge of the preparations made for this invasion by Xerxes comes from Herodotus. He may have exaggerated some things in his account, but his history was written for Greeks of his own time, and he wanted to make clear to them how great was the difference between the East and the West, how much better their freedom and independence were than the slavery endured by states which were ruled by the great king. For these states had no voice in the affairs of the empire. If the king went to war, they had to follow him, and lay down their lives for causes in which they had no concern, and which generally only ministered to the greed and avarice of their rulers. Having decided on the invasion of Greece, Xerxes sent heralds throughout the empire, proclaiming the war and bidding all fighting men make ready, and join the king at Sardis. There the troops were mustered, and in the spring of 480 BC, 10 years after the Battle of Marathon, Xerxes and his army were ready to set out. They were to march to the Hellespont, and then by way of Thrace and Macedonia to descend into Greece. The fleet was to join the army at the Hellespont, and by sailing close to the shore, to keep in constant touch with the army on land. At last all was ready, and the day came for the army to leave Sardis. First the baggage-bearers led the way together with their horses, and after these half the infantry of all the nations who followed the great king. Then a space was left, after which came the king himself. Before him went first 1,000 horsemen, chosen from among the noblest Persians, and then 1,000 spearmen. These were followed by 10 sacred horses rich with trappings, and behind the horses came the sacred chariot of the great Persian god, drawn by 8 horses, with the reins held by a charioteer on foot, for no human creature might mount upon the seat of that chariot. Then followed Xerxes himself, attended by spearmen chosen from the best and most noble of all the Persians. They were in turn followed by a body of men known as the Immortals, of which there were always 10,000. They bore this name because if any one of them made the number incomplete, either by death or illness, another man filled his place, and there were never either more or fewer than 10,000. These were the very flower of the Persian army. 9,000 of them carried spears ending with silver pomegranates, and the spears of the 1,000 who guarded the front and rear were ornamented with pomegranates of gold. Now of all the nations the Persians showed the greatest splendor of ornament, and were themselves the best men, and they were conspicuous for the great quantity of gold they used. The Medes and Persians wore tunics and trousers, for which the Greeks always felt the greatest contempt, because they were worn by the barbarian and not the Greek, and soft felt caps on their heads. They carried wicker shields and had short spears and daggers, and bows and arrows. Besides these, a host of nations followed the great king. There were Assyrians, famous throughout all ancient history as a great fighting race, with bronze helmets, linen breastplates, and wooden clubs studded with iron. There were Bactrians with bows of reed and short spears, Scythians with their pointed sheepskin caps and their battle axes. There were Caspians dressed in skins and wielding short swords. There were men of strange and savage appearance, some wearing dyed garments with high boots, others dressed in skins and all bearing bows and arrows, daggers and short spears. Arabians came too with their loose robes caught up, ready for action, and long bows in their hands. And dark Ethiopians, fearful to look upon in their garments made of the skins of the leopard and the lion. These fought with long bows with sharp pointed arrows, and with spears and clubs. And when they went into battle, each man painted half his body white and half of it red. And other Ethiopians there were, who wore upon their heads horses' scalps, with the ears and manes still attached. Many more nations and tribes were represented in this mighty army. Some carried small shields and small spears and daggers. Others wore bronze helmets, to which the ears and horns of an ox were attached. All these and many more made up the army of the great king. They came from north and south, from east and west, and from the islands of the sea. And when they marched in magnificent array from Sardis to the shores of the Hellespont, where the fleet was to meet them. When Xerxes reached the strait, he had a throne of white marble built for him, and there he took his seat and gazed upon his army and his ships. Now Xerxes had given orders that a bridge should be built across the Hellespont, over which his army should pass into Europe. But when the strait had been bridged over, a great storm arose which destroyed the bridge. When Xerxes heard of it, he was exceedingly enraged, and bade his soldiers scourge the Hellespont with 300 strokes of the lash. And he let down into the sea a pair of fetters. Whilst this was being done, the sea was thus addressed: Thou bitter water, thy master lays on thee this penalty, because thou didst him wrong, though never having suffered any wrong from him. And Xerxes the king will pass over thee, whether thou be willing or no. The sea was punished in this way, and command was given to cut off the heads of those who had charge of building the bridge. Not with impunity was the great king disobeyed. A new bridge was then built, stronger and more secure than the first, and over this the army passed safely. In order that no accidents might happen, honor was paid to the gods, and incense and fragrant perfumes were burnt upon the bridge, and the road was strewn with branches of myrtle. The crossing was to take place early in the morning, and all were ready before the dawn broke. As the sun was rising, Xerxes poured a libation from a golden cup into the sea, and prayed to the sun that no accident might befall him till he had conquered Europe, even to its furthest limits. Having prayed, he cast the cup into the Hellespont, and with it a golden mixing bowl and a Persian sword, as gifts to the powers of the sea. When Xerxes had done this, the great army passed over the bridge in brilliant array. It took 7 days and 7 nights without any pause for the whole army to pass over, and it is said that at the end, a man who dwelt on that coast and who had watched the crossing exclaimed, Why, O Zeus, in the name of a Persian man, and taking for thyself the name of Xerxes instead of Zeus, hast thou brought all the nations of men to subdue Hellas? Was it not possible for thee to do it without the help of these? When the whole army had crossed over safely, Xerxes inspected it. He drove through all the ranks in his chariot, and scribes who accompanied him wrote down for him the names of all the nations who were represented. When he had done this, the ships were drawn down into the sea, and Xerxes, changing from his chariot to a ship of Sidon, sat down under a gold canopy and sailed along by the prows of the ships and inspected his fleet. The ships then set sail and were to go along the coast to Thermo, where the land army was to meet them again. Xerxes and the army then proceeded on their march through Thrace and Macedonia. Messengers had been sent on ahead some time before to make arrangements for provisioning this great host. All the towns through which the Persians passed were compelled to provide food and drink for the men and the animals with them. It was a tremendous undertaking, and scarcity and want were left behind as the invaders passed on. The inhabitants had to provide great quantities of wheat and barley. They were made to give up the best of the fatted cattle, their birds and fowls, and to provide everything in the way of gold and silver needed for the service of the table. All this was a great hardship to the people of the land, and in one place they went in a body to their temple and entreated the gods that for the future they would keep them from such evil. Nevertheless, they offered up a thanksgiving to the gods for all the mercies that had been shown them in the past, and especially for having granted that Xerxes, whilst in their city, had only thought to take food once in each day, for it would have been altogether impossible then to have provided him with breakfast in the same manner as dinner. The fleet sailed safely to Thermia, and was joined there by the army as had been arranged. So far all had gone well for the Persians. They had succeeded in a great achievement, for apparently without any serious mishaps, this tremendous army had been transported from Sardis right round the Aegean, and had been fed and cared for on the way. The difficulties must have been very great, and only splendid organization could have done it successfully. But it had been done, and as Xerxes, in order to wreak his vengeance on one Greek city, stood with his army composed of the fighting men of 46 nations on the very threshold of Greece. From Thermia he could look across to the mountains of Thessaly. He could see snow-topped Olympus, the home of the gods who watched over the fortunes of the freedom-loving Greeks. The Athenians had withstood the Persians at Marathon, but now the whole of the eastern world was marching against them. Could they withstand that mighty host, or would they be forced to submit? The Greeks. 10 years had passed between the Battle of Marathon and the arrival of Xerxes on the borders of Greece. In the years preceding 490 BC, the Persian power had been a terror to the Greek. Not content with subduing Asia even to the dim borders of India, the great kings had pushed their way to the Aegean, and had even conquered the Greeks who dwelt along its eastern coasts. Then, like an ominous war cloud, this mighty power had crossed the sea to Greece itself. But there the unexpected had happened. At Marathon, the Persians had sustained at the hands of a small state, till then comparatively unknown, the first great defeat they had ever met with. The Plataeans had helped, it is true, but their numbers had been small, and it was the Athenians who had really defeated the Persians. Since then, the Athenians had enjoyed a great reputation for their military power. Myths and legends had woven themselves around the name of Marathon, with the result that the power of the Athenians was reputed greater than perhaps it actually was, and that of Persia was certainly depreciated. If she had been as formidable as had always been supposed, how could the Athenians have defeated her almost unaided? So for a number of years the Greeks had felt less terror at the name of Persia, and they had been enjoying a certain feeling of security, little realizing how false it was. But suddenly they were shaken out of their calm. Rumors of the Persian preparations for an invasion of Greece reached them, rumors which were doubtless exaggerated, but which nevertheless had much truth in them. It is amazing how, in spite of slow and difficult communication, news was swiftly carried in those days from place to place. So the Greeks were fairly well informed as to what the Persians were doing. At this crisis, the Athenians took the lead, and if anyone should say that the Athenians proved to be the saviors of Hellas, he would not fail to hit the truth. These were they who, preferring that Hellas should continue to exist in freedom, roused up all of Hellas, ordered fearful oracles which came from Delphi and cast them into dread, induce them to leave Hellas. The first thing the Greeks did was to hold a conference at Corinth, which was attended by envoys from all the leading states, except Argos and Thebes, which stood aloof. At this conference, the Greeks made 3 important decisions. They resolved that they would reconcile all their own differences and bring to an end the wars they had with one another. As Hellenes, they would unite against the common foe. Then they determined to send spies to Asia, who should bring back accurate reports of the preparations and power of Xerxes. And lastly, they would send messengers to the colonies in Sicily, Corcyra, and Crete, asking for assistance. 3 spies set out, but they were captured in Sardis and condemned to death. When Xerxes, however, heard what had happened, he sent for the spies, who were brought into his presence. To their surprise, instead of being led out to immediate execution, Xerxes commanded that they should be led around and shown the whole army, both foot and horse. And when they had seen everything, they were to be set free to return home. He did this because he said that, if the spies had been put to death, the Hellenes would not have been informed of his power, how far beyond any description it was, while on the other hand, by putting to death 3 men, they would not very greatly damage the enemy. But when these returned back to Hellas, he thought it likely that the Hellenes, hearing of his power, would deliver up their freedom to him themselves, before the expedition took place, and thus there would be no need for them to have the labor of marching an army against them. Little did Xerxes know the kind of freedom-loving people with whom he had to deal. So the spies looked at everything and then returned to Greece. Meanwhile, the messengers to the colonies returned. The answers to the appeal for support were very disappointing. Neither Sicily, Corcyra, nor Crete would help. They either refused outright or made uncertain answers. They seemed to have thought more of their own preservation than that of the safety of Greece as a whole. They thought the Persians would probably win, and they preferred either to be on the winning side or to be in such a position that they could make good terms with the Persian, did he conquer. The Greeks now made ready to go out with their armies to meet the Persian foe. The chief command was given to Sparta, the greatest military state in Greece, and they marched to the Vale of Tempe in the north of Thessaly, where they hoped to meet Xerxes and prevent him from coming to Greece. When they got there, however, they found that it would not be possible to hold the pass against the enemy, for it was so situated that the Persians could attack them by sea as well as by land, and there was another path over the mountains by which the Persians could attack them in the rear. So the Greeks withdrew to Corinth in order to deliberate further where they should meet the enemy. This retreat from Thessaly took place while Xerxes and his army were crossing the Hellespont, and it had important consequences for the Persians. For the Thessalians, hitherto never very loyal to Greece, seeing the other Greeks leave their land, took the side of the Medes with a good will, and no longer half-heartedly, so that in the course of the events they proved very serviceable to the king. The Greeks now decided on making a stand much further south at Thermopylae. There was a narrow pass and easier to defend, so they resolved to guard it and not permit the barbarian to go by into Hellas. And they resolved that the fleet should sail to Artemisium, for these points are near to one another, so that each division of their forces could have information of what was happening at the other. At Thermopylae, the Greeks awaited the Persians. Thermopylae. It was midsummer in the year 480 BC when the Persian host left Therma and marched down through Thessaly to the pass of Thermopylae. The Persians encamped before the pass, and a scout was sent forward to bring back information as to what the Greeks were doing. Only a small force of Greeks was defending the pass. The main part of the Greek army was kept back further to the south to defend the isthmus. A small body of about 300 Spartans had been sent under the King Leonidas to defend the pass of Thermopylae, and if possible to prevent the Persians from advancing further into Greece. These 300 men were the picked bodyguard of the king, a force in which only fathers of sons might serve, so that their families might not die out of Sparta. The Persian scout went cautiously forward, and to his great surprise saw some of the Spartans practicing athletic exercises, and others combing their long hair. He could not see the rest, as an ancient wall built across the pass hid them from sight. He returned to Xerxes and reported on what he had seen. The king sent for a Greek who was in his camp, and asked him what this behavior of the Spartans might mean. He told him that they were following an ancient Spartan custom, for whenever they are about to put their lives in peril, then they attend to the arrangement of their hair. The Spartans knew against what odds they had to fight, but their duty had placed them where they were, and no Spartan ever retreated or turned his back upon the foe. The great king intended to attack at the same moment, both by land and by sea. The fleets were at Artemisium, and there were 4 times as many Persian ships as Greek. A hot and sultry summer's day had passed, and the signal to attack was expected in the morning. But at early dawn the sea began to be violently agitated, and a strong east wind arose. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and soon a terrible storm broke. The Greek ships were in safety, but a large number of Persian ships were wrecked, and great treasures were lost. For 3 days the storm continued, and for 3 days Xerxes had to wait before he could attack the pass. When on the 4th day the storm died down, the sea fight began. 3 times over the Greeks attacked the Persian ships, and each time they prevailed against them. After the 3rd fight, news was brought to Themistocles, the Athenian general, that 200 Persian ships sailing to the Greek rear had been lost in the storm, so that there was nothing more to fear from an attack in that direction. The Greeks succeeded in throwing the Persian ships into confusion, and so crippled the fleet that they finally won the battle. It was then that Xerxes gave the order to his army to attack the pass. For the whole of a hot summer's day the Persians attacked. First the Medes tried to force the pass, but it was narrow, and as they met the Spartans' spears, down they went, man after man. Hour after hour this continued, but every attack was repulsed, and hardly a Spartan fell. Then the Medes withdrew, and the Immortals took their place. They were fresh and greatly superior to the Spartans in numbers, but neither could they prevail against them. At times the Spartans would make a pretense of turning to flight, but when the barbarians followed after them with shouting and clashing of arms, then they turned and faced the barbarians, and slew large numbers of them. The Spartans lost a few men, but at the end of the day the Persians drew back, exhausted and defeated, and the Spartans still held the pass. The next day the same thing happened. So great was the slaughter of Persians on this day, that 3 times Xerxes leapt up from his seat from which he was watching the fight, in deadly fear for his army. But by the end of the day the pass had not been taken, and again the Persians withdrew, exhausted and driven back, leaving large numbers of their companions lying dead before the pass. Xerxes was in great straits as to what he should do next, when he was told that a man desired audience of him. He was a Greek who lived in that region, and he offered, if the Persian would reward him with enough gold, to lead his army by a path known to him, but of which the Spartans were ignorant, over the mountain to a spot from which the pass might be attacked in the rear. It was a long and difficult path, but the traitor knew it well, and would guide them surely. The reward was promised, and about the time when the lamps were lit in the camp, the Immortals with their commander set out under the guidance of the traitor. All through the long black night they climbed by a steep and rocky path, and when dawn appeared they had reached the summit of the mountain. In this region, 1,000 men of Phocis were stationed to protect their own country and the path which led down to the valley below. They could not see the Persians as they climbed, for the sides of the mountain were covered with oak trees. But in the great silence which falls upon nature just before dawn, suddenly these men heard an unexpected sound. It was the Persians stepping on the dried oak leaves which lay thickly on the ground beneath their feet. The Greeks started up, and when the Persians, coming suddenly upon them, discharged their arrows at them, they retreated to a higher position close at hand, where they waited for the expected attack. To their surprise, however, the enemy turned away and left them. On went the traitor, followed by the Persians, until they were on the road in the rear of Leonidas. While it was yet night, scouts came down from the mountains where they had been keeping watch, and told Leonidas that the pass was turned, and that the enemy was approaching it from the rear. Leonidas knew what that meant. The end had come, but he commanded Spartans, and he knew that whilst one remained alive, the pass would not be taken. At sunrise, according to the arrangement made with the traitor, Xerxes attacked. The Spartans, knowing that they were going forth to death, now advanced further out into the broader space in front of the pass, where there was more room. And then followed a fight which will never be forgotten. The barbarians made attack after attack, and the Spartans slew them and drove them back every time. Many were driven into the sea and perished, and many more were trodden down while still alive and trampled to death. And there was no reckoning of the number that perished. 2 brothers of Xerxes fell fighting, and then Leonidas fell. The Spartans fought for the body of their king. Most of their spears were by this time broken, so they fought and slew the Persians with their swords. 4 times the Persians had almost taken the body of the king, and 4 times they were driven back by the Spartans, when word came that the immortals were attacking the pass in the rear. Then the remaining Spartans placed themselves with the body of Leonidas behind the wall, and there they made their last defense. Those who still had them defended themselves with daggers, and those who had no weapons left fought with their hands and teeth, until, overwhelmed by the barbarians who were now assailing them both in the front and in the rear, they were surrounded and cut down until not a Spartan was left alive. And so the Persians took the pass, and the road to Athens lay clear before them. The Spartans were buried where they fell, and a pillar was erected to the memory of those who had died so great a death in defending the pass. On it was inscribed the simple words, "Stranger, bear word to the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their charge." Themistocles. The Persians had taken the pass of Thermopylae. Thebes, the chief city in Boeotia, was anxious to be on the winning side, and was a medazing state. There was nothing to save Athens from the conquering Persian army. But in this dark hour a statesman arose in Athens who was to restore her confidence, and to make her place secure among the free nations of the world. This man was Themistocles, already known to the Athenians as the admiral who had defeated the Persians at Artemisium. He came of a humble family, but the laws made by Solon and later lawgivers made it possible for him, in spite of his birth, to rise to the highest position in the state. From his youth, Themistocles had been of a vehement and impetuous nature, of a quick intelligence and a strong and aspiring bent for action and great affairs. The holidays and intervals in his studies he did not spend in play or idleness as other children, but would be always inventing or arranging some oration or speech to himself, so that his master would often say to him, "You, my boy, will be nothing small, but great one way or another, for good or else for bad." He received reluctantly and carelessly instructions given him to improve his manners and behavior, or to teach him any pleasing or graceful accomplishment. But whatever was said to improve him in sagacity or in management of affairs, he would give attention to beyond one of his years. And when in company he was obliged to defend himself because he could not play on any stringed instrument, he would retort that though he could not do that, yet were a small and obscure city put into his hands, he would make it grand and glorious. It is said that Themistocles was so transported with the thoughts of glory, and so inflamed with the passion for great actions, that though he was still young when the Battle of Marathon was fought, upon the skillful conduct of the general Miltiades being everywhere talked about, he was observed to be thoughtful and reserved. Alone by himself, he passed the nights without sleep, and avoided all his usual places of recreation. And to those who wondered at the change and inquired the reason of it, he gave the answer that the trophy of Miltiades would not let him sleep. This was the man who was now to help Athens, and he possessed the very qualities most needed in the serious position in which she found herself. For Themistocles was a man whose natural force was unmistakable. This was the quality for which he was distinguished above all other men, from his own native acuteness, and without any study either before or at the time. He was the ablest judge of the course to be pursued in a sudden emergency, and could best divine what was likely to happen in the remotest future. Whatever he had in hand, he had the power of explaining to others, and even where he had no experience, he was quite competent to form a sufficient judgment. No one could foresee with equal clearness the good or evil intent which was hidden in the future. This foresight was shown in the belief held by Themistocles, who, when others were of the opinion that the Battle of Marathon would be an end to the war, thought it was but the beginning of far greater conflicts, and because of this belief he did his best to encourage the Athenians to be ready for whatever might happen. And this seems like a good place to call it a night. Bit of an action-packed one tonight, but I'm a boring reader, so I'm sure you're asleep by now. If you would like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.